Tonight we have the opportunity to speak with Utah State House Representative Jake Anderegg from House District 6, who is a candidate for State Senate District 13. He is running to replace outgoing State Senator Mark Madsen. First off, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you for being here. My name is Jake Anderegg. I am the representative for House District 6 in the state legislature, and I am running for Senate District 13. I'm a native Utahn, born and raised here. Lived in Lehigh for the last 15, coming on 16 years. Been married to Julie Anderegg for the last 18 years, and we have 5 beautiful children, 2 of which we adopted from China. I attended Brigham Young University and graduated with a bachelor's in economics, and then went and got my master's degree in business administration from Westminster College. I currently work at Zions Bank in their Premier Wealth Management Department, working with private bankers and executive bankers. And I've served we're in our 4th year in the House of Representatives in the state, and been able to get a lot of good stuff done.
Why do you want to be the senator for District 13?
Well, this area is the fastest growing area in the state. And I've had the opportunity to represent the people of Lehigh and a small section of Saratoga Springs as we've experienced unprecedented growth, economic development, and new move-ins. And the reality is that we've got a lot of challenges facing us. This northern Utah County area is just booming. In fact, Thanksgiving Point between August of this year and into January of next year, we're going to add 4,000 new jobs there at Thanksgiving Point, and that means 4,000 new cars, transportation, the impacts on property taxes that will trickle down into education funding. I mean, we've got a lot going on, and the reality is I feel like I've just skimmed the surface so far. It takes a steady hand, consistent hand at the wheel, making sure that we have consistent improvements in education and in economic development and in transportation and in fiscal discipline, balancing that the right way. And I think that I am the best candidate to serve in that position. I've got a lot of experience, and I want to bring that experience to bear in serving the people of District 13. Eagle Mountain, Saratoga Springs, sections of Harriman and Highland.
What have you been able to accomplish as a state representative?
Oh, we've done a lot. The very first thing I did in my first session was House Bill 391, which was the prohibition of Medicaid expansion. In essence, it didn't preclude us from ever or prohibit us from ever expanding Medicaid, but it said if we're going to do it, we have to do a thorough study. We have to look at what the financial implications are, and most importantly, that it come through the executive appropriations process here at the legislature. In other words, the governor couldn't just expand without the appropriations process, because there's a big chunk of it that we have to come up with as a state. So we would have expanded, I'm confident the governor would have expanded Medicaid had my bill not passed. So that was right out of the gates a very big bill. Additionally, in that first session, I was able to pass the protection of concealed carry permit information. There were people back east that were taking the concealed carry permit information and overlaying it with a Google map in New York and New Jersey. I ran the bill to make it so that was not publicly accessible information. Still, law enforcement could get access for when they have a relevant case related to it, but it wasn't going to be for public consumption anymore. Additionally, last session we did an appropriations and budgeting amendment. In really delving into the budget, me and several of the fiscal analysts discovered there were about $42 million of off-the-books accounting happening in the state. And we shouldn't be doing any off-the-books accounting. The appropriations process should have the full picture of all expenditures and savings and whatnot. So the appropriations and budgeting amendment, House Bill 193, basically put an end to that. And then the bill that I did last session, which is going to be expanded and I'm going to run this session, was House Bill 68, which was the Student Privacy Study and Act. And the Student Privacy Bill was really trying to put the guardrails on as we head down this information highway of what information can be collected, how that information, from your students in public education, how that information needs to be secured and stored, and then who can access or how that information can be shared. So these are big things for, I think, the public, and I'm really looking forward to moving forward on them.
What will you try to accomplish in this upcoming legislative session in 2016?
Well, so the student privacy bill that I did last session was a study. I wanted to push the Department of Education, the State Department of Education, into looking at where, doing an internal audit, if you will, where they're doing well, what they need to improve on. They've come up with a series of recommendations based upon that, on that study. And the Student Privacy Act that I'm going to pass this year will actually put into law those guardrails, so that we can't just be collecting all sorts of information that are both relevant and irrelevant to public education. In addition to that, I have a bill called the Longitudinal Data Management Act. And the longitudinal data is basically, if you collect information from public education and from higher education and from Division of Workforce Services and possibly Tax Commission and law enforcement or whatnot, and you compile that, it can become a very good predictive tool for policy-making decisions. But the problem is there should be some opt-out provisions. There should be participation, authorization, and full disclosure. I mean, as we're heading down this information highway, it can't be the wild, wild west. We have to have protocol and policies and procedure for how we're going to deal with the public's information, and they should have a right to access that. In addition, I've got another improvement to education, a dual pathway called the Utah Apprenticeship Authorization Act. And in essence, it's going to allow juniors and seniors who have certain skill sets, who want to go into certain fields, that they can go and get an apprenticeship. It's a 4-year program that will allow them to basically get an apprenticeship certificate, to get real, not only the theoretical that they get from school, but real actual practical application in real-world industry, like Boeing and maybe Microsoft or Domo or some of these other medical assisting. And they can actually get an apprenticeship certificate that is the equivalent of both a high school diploma and an associate's degree. And they do it and they get paid to do it, and they come out with no debt. And then obviously some additional movements towards the next bill that I have in mind is to do some economic development incentives, improving that process. I mean, our area has been one that has benefited a lot, but we have to make sure that we're being fiscally disciplined and smart with those resources. And then in addition to that, transportation funding. This area is just booming. We've got to recruit the businesses here, but we also have to provide the infrastructure so that they can thrive once they are here, as well as our citizenry being able to get through to their own jobs without having too much difficulty. So that's what I've got on my agenda for this upcoming session in January.
And all these things you all work on simultaneously, or is it you do one and then you can move on to the next?
Oh, yeah. We only have a 45-day window in this session. It goes from January 25th through March 11th. And it is like a sprint that is nothing else I've ever experienced. So yes, I am working on all of these simultaneously, and it's a fine line in juggling your own bills as well and shepherding them through the process, as well as managing the other bills that you've got to vote on both your committees and on the floor. And it's always a balancing act of making sure you shepherd your bills through, as well as being prepared with the latest versions to vote informed on all the bills that are going to come before the floor or to a committee. So it's an interesting process.
Do you foresee a lot of opposition, or are these bills fairly easy to pass, just because it seems so beneficial to everyone?
The truth is if your bill is easy to pass, it probably doesn't have much substance. If your bill is difficult to pass, it's either way too ideological that you'll pigeonhole yourself and won't get it passed, or it's because you're negotiating and you're actually working through the process and making sure that all sides are not happy, but that you're moving the needle in the right direction. If everybody gets everything they want, then it's not a good bill. If everyone has to compromise a little bit in order to move the needle a particular way, then it's a good bill. So I do envision some opposition, but I also know that I've built a really good framework in negotiating with the parties, and I think that I'm going to have a lot of success this session.
How did you vote on SB 54, the so-called Count My Vote initiative, and why?
Oh, SB 54, the Count My Vote deal it's a bad bill. It was a bad bill from start to finish. At the end of the day, we were told that it was being passed in order to save the caucus system. You know, there may be an element of truth to that, but it's only true if we then follow up with repealing it a year or two down the road. Because if it stays in place, it's going to become the process that we use. I voted against it because I felt like the process we have through the caucus convention system is by far the best way to allow people who may not come from a lot of money the opportunity to run. It doesn't take a lot of money to go through the caucus convention system. It's a one-on-one process, and it's a great process for vetting candidates. You know, it's kind of the 80-20 rule, right? 80% of the populace is disengaged and doesn't care, and 20% does and is informed. Well, it's usually those 20% that then go to the caucus, and at that caucus then really grill the candidates and find out where they would stand and what principles they follow in basing their decisions as they represent the constituents. So it's a great process, but what Count My Vote actually does is it allows someone who doesn't win the nomination through the caucus convention system to still get on the ballot and try to as a Republican. And the Republican Party should have the ability to manage its brand. If you go through the Republican process of nomination, you should have the R behind your name. If you don't go through that process, should you have the R behind your name? I mean, you have freedom of association is guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. So I think this is still needing to have its day in court, and I have no intention of doing the Count My Vote signatures. I plan completely to do the caucus and convention system. But I'm waiting to see what the courts rule before the session begins. So we'll wait to see what compromises or maybe strike downs are made from now until January 25th.
What was your position on the prison relocation? And were you in favor or opposed to it being located in Utah County?
Well, I was opposed to it being located in Utah County, but I wasn't opposed to its moving. A lot of the buildings down in the Draper facility had worn out their lifespan and were needing to be replaced. I think the land itself has become so valuable, both to the state as well as to the cities in that area, that leaving it there was going to be problematic. And what a lot of people don't understand is I think it was 1948, the prison used to be located in Sugar House. And they moved it way out into Draper because no one lived there and no one was going to live there for a long time. Well, 75 plus years later, we've all built up around it, and it's prime real estate, and the reality is it's very much in demand. And so I wasn't opposed from the standpoint of that it could be a boon for the state if we were to move it. But I wasn't absolutely set on making sure that it moved. If it had stayed in Draper, I would have been okay with that. But I voted to move it because I felt like the state had done enough research to know that if they moved the prison, it was going to be an economic benefit to Salt Lake City as well as to Draper and Salt Lake County. So, but I did not want it in Utah County. I felt like it was too far away from a lot of the services that needed to be provided, even though the land would have been cheaper out in Eagle Mountain, which was one of the key spots they were looking at. There was no way I wanted it out there. It was too far away. It would have been very problematic. This is right off of I-80 where it ended up moving, and I think it's just a fantastic location for it. You always have to balance the costs of moving versus the benefits, and sometimes those benefits can be projected, and sometimes they can't adequately be projected. In this case, I felt like they did. I think that the state made a really compelling argument to show that it should be moved. I think that the Economic Development Corporation of Utah, as well as the Governor's Office of Economic Development, showed that it was going to be beneficial in both locations. I think that over the next 5 to 10 years, as the prison is built in Salt Lake City, I think we're going to see a lot of economic development in both locations. It's going to be very beneficial to the state.
How important do you believe honesty and integrity is in politics and in establishing public trust?
Great questions. I think that honesty and integrity is vital. If you can't trust what your elected officials are saying to you, then we've got a systemic problem. We've got a major problem. And I think that establishing public trust is what we have to focus on every single day. Does that mean that in every single situation that I share everything I absolutely know in every single and the reality is most people don't want to know all the ins and outs about everything. But if someone asks the question, you've got to be able to give them a response. And so it actually is becoming upon us as elected officials to, number one, share what my principles are and why I'm going to represent you the right way. Number two, go and represent you the way I said that I was going to represent you. And then number three, come back and educate you on how I voted and why I voted the way I did. And it's really, really important for those lines of communication to be open, as well as, you know what, you got to answer the tough questions. And if someone has an issue with you, you've got to sit down with them and you've got to say, this is why I voted the way I did. And inevitably, as I've done that in half a dozen to a dozen cases, I've sat down with people saying, yeah, man, you're an idiot. You voted this way on this bill or this issue. And then I sat down and say, hey, this is what you know. This is what you don't know. Okay, you've gotten this from the media, but this is what I've gotten through all the channels that I've, in the governor's office and blah, blah. And because of that and the proper role of government, I felt like this was the best way. And inevitably, every time I've done that, I've had people go, okay, I can understand why you voted the way you did. So it's all about education. It's all about lines of communication.
Now in politics, honesty and integrity are, to the general public, maybe the general uneducated necessarily, honesty and integrity aren't necessarily words that seem to go well with politics.
It is a bit of an oxymoron.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
How do you combat that, or how do you reconcile that notion that honesty, integrity in politics is an oxymoron?
Well, it is because we've seen it done wrong so many times in so many different situations, and I think it's human nature to not want the things that are unpleasant to be known publicly, especially if you haven't acted the way you said you were going to act. So I think that the way you combat it is you disclose. You disclose and you disclose. And you say, okay, this is where we're at. These are the issues on the table. This is what's behind the scenes. And this is the proper way forward. Coupled with being in front of people and explaining to them the situations and helping to build those relationships of trust, which, as we all know, they can be dashed really quickly and are really hard to rebuild. So it takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of time. And at times I feel like I've done really well at doing that, and other times I haven't had the time to do it as much as I wish I should have, as far as reaching out and educating. And it's hard because we're a part-time legislature, and I've got a full-time job outside of this, and I've got a family to provide for. But it is a constant effort of reaching out and informing and building those relationships of trust. And if ever they get dashed, then we've got to go rebuild that bridge.
So we did some research on you before this interview, and we did a public search and found that you filed for a Chapter 7 bankruptcy in 2004 and a Chapter 13 bankruptcy in 2009. What can you tell us about these and why you filed for bankruptcy?
Those were some really difficult times for me and my family. But they have, I think, very good explanations. Do I wish that I hadn't had to go through bankruptcy? Absolutely. I wish I had maybe done some things differently and avoided them. I'm an entrepreneur at heart, and I've run my own businesses multiple times. And I ran a construction company and a real estate development company from 2001 through 2008 when the market tanked. And I trusted some people I shouldn't have trusted, and it was my fault. I should have been watching the books a little bit better. I had a business partner that basically embezzled some money in 2003. And at the latter part of 2003, he filed for bankruptcy, and he and his family out of the state, left me holding the bag. And we had some real estate property and developments that I was working to sell and to get taken care of. And the reality is when your cash reserves are gone, it's really hard to do that. I used all of my personal resources, everything that I possibly had, and I held on for about 9 to 10 months. But eventually I just, I sat down with legal advice and talked to my attorney and just said, I don't know how to get out of this issue. And they advised me to do a Chapter 7. It was horrible. It was a very, very tough situation to go through. And but I kept on answering people's phone calls, any creditors. I kept on paying people as soon as I got money in, as fast as I could. I did everything I could to make people whole. Not everybody was made whole, but I still feel like I have a moral obligation. If ever I'm in a position to make people whole, I will. And I think that says a lot about who I am and my character. I just need to get to a point where I can. Then after that, we recovered a little bit in 2005 and 2006 because the market was still really strong at that time. But what a lot of people don't understand is that in 2007 in the construction industry, that's when the financial wheels fell off the vehicle. They just, we all know about the big crash in the fall of 2008. But construction lending, acquisition and development funding dried up completely about June or July of 2007, and I did everything I could possibly do. I sold the spec homes we had and the rental properties that I had, and was fortunate enough to be able to divest a lot of those both assets as well as debt obligations. And I felt very blessed, but from 2006 to 2007, I saw my income went from over $100,000 a year down to about $65,000 in 2007. 2008, it was about $21,000. 2009, it was about $24,000. When you go from making a living, and I hadn't fully recovered from the bankruptcy yet, right? And the tank the bottom fell out of the marketplace, and I was scrambling. I was finishing people's basements by myself. I was painting people's rooms. I was finishing decks, and stairwells. I was pouring concrete pavement. Any job I could possibly find, I was out working. But by about 2009, August of 2009, I couldn't keep up with it. I was getting late on my own mortgage. It just was a tough situation to be in. So I went back to my attorneys and just said, hey, I'm still just fighting tooth and nail. And they advised me to file, but I didn't want to do a Chapter 7 again. I wanted to still have an obligation where I paid something, so we did a Chapter 13. And it made a huge difference. They gave me a 5-year plan, and I had it paid off in 3 years. Things rebounded a little bit in 2009 and a lot in 2010, and I'm now in a totally different place. And do I wish I hadn't had to go through all of that? Absolutely, but it's made me who I am. I'm a Dave Ramsey disciple now, and I am very fiscally conservative, and I operate my home the same way that I function up here in the legislature, that we cut taxes whenever we can, as often as we can, as much as we can, and that we live within our means all the time. And but it was a hard time in my life. It was a hard time in my family's life. But I have turned the corner and did so in 2011, 2012, and I felt inspired to run for office in 2012 and won. And I had this conversation with many delegates in my first race. I didn't do a big old, interview like this where I disclosed it to everybody, but this is part of being, in front of people and giving the full disclosure and letting them know that I don't have anything to hide. I'm here. I'm willing to serve. I think I am really good at it. and I care and have a lot of compassion for people who've also gone through what I've gone through. And yet I've learned some things that will help me never ever be in that situation again. And I think if we can bring those principles I learned and those lessons I learned to bear in our state legislature, regardless of what happens with the federal government and in our nation, we're going to do all right. It's going to be tough, but you want someone up there that's had to make tough decisions, who's been in that deep dark hole and clawed their way out of it, and knows what it's like, because it's not easy, because you're having to make decisions between good and better, and sometimes good doesn't get what it needs when you're in that situation, but you keep answering your phone, you keep getting up every day, you keep going to work, and you turn over every stone that you can possibly find to make things whole. So that's who I am, and that's what I'll bring to bear serving in the state Senate.
Recently, there's been some controversy in the news about a Swiss trip involving some UTA board members, and your name has been included with this trip. What can you tell us about this trip?
You know what? This was actually my trip. And believe it or not, UTA had nothing to do with this trip. It didn't. I know it's been reported that way. I know that they're trying to say that a board member resigned because of it, but what they're not telling you is that this board member told the Mountain Land Association of Governments group, which are all the mayors in Utah County and Summit County and Wasatch County, a month before we went on this trip, he had told them he was going to resign from UTA, that he couldn't manage both serving in UTA as well as serving and working his job. So UTA didn't have anything to do with this, but this trip was actually a really good trip. It's a great opportunity for the state of Utah. We, through some of my contacts and relatives, I come from Switzerland. Anderegg is a Swiss name. Julius Anderegg, who's the Consul General of Switzerland, he and I made a friendship in 2012, and by 2014, he came into town to go see the premiere of MIT at Sundance Film Festival, and in that process we went to dinner, and I kind of started saying, hey, you know, Swiss companies should be looking at Utah. We have a lot of Swiss people here. And he said, well, there's an economic development forum in June of 2014. I can get you tickets to it if you want to come. So I got a couple of legislators, and we went and we raised our own money for this trip, and we flew out there, and we met with a company, the CEO of a company called Stadler Rail. Stadler Rail is a huge manufacturing company of light rail, commuter rail cars. And they said to us, hey, we're actually looking in the United States to set up our U.S. headquarters right now. And we said, well, you need to be coming to Utah. You need to look at Utah. And we got them to commit to come to Utah. Well, a year later, in June of 2015, Peter Spuler and his team came to Utah. And we rolled out the red carpet, and we showed them everything that we can do. And they were very impressed, exceedingly impressed. And they loved the mountains. It has very much a Swiss feel to it, above Texas or New York, New Jersey, or the Bay Area in California. And so they really liked it, and we went to make the introductions to GoEd, and they were looking for facilities. Admittedly, one of the facilities they were looking at was a facility that is only being partially used by UTA, called the Warm Springs facility in northern Salt Lake City. So that's the only tie to UTA. Some of the legislators, we did a return trip to Switzerland in September, and this is the one that's gotten all the controversy. But we went out and we raised the money for this. We didn't use taxpayer dollars. It wasn't UTA funded at all. We went out and we met with lobbyists who are interested in transit-oriented developments and rail systems, as well as transportation issues, and we went out and raised the money. And the main purpose of this trip was to do two things. Number one, educate lawmakers on the possibilities of mountain accord, like mountain rail systems, public-private partnerships that they have in Switzerland. How did they pull it off? Because it is a big subsidization if you're just doing it all on taxpayer dollars. How did they pull it off? And so we went and we did the rail systems. But in addition to that, the other reason to go was to try to button up this potential site relocation for Stad the Rail, this economic development opportunity, as well as a few other economic development opportunities that I'm not prepared to talk about yet because they're still very early in their negotiating stages and we don't want to muddy the water. But Stad the Rail, when we were out there, basically stood up, the president and CEO basically stood up, shook our hands and said, I think we're coming to Utah. Now, that was contingent upon, were there incentives that are post-performance incentives from the Governor's Office of Economic Development, meaning if they don't come and they don't make money and they don't ever set up, they don't get a dime. So that had to be put in place. There were about $10 million of incentives there. They're all post-performance. Additionally to that, one of the facilities they were looking at renting was this UTA facility. That's still ongoing. I don't know if that's the location or another location that they're actually ultimately going to win and move to, but they basically have told us they're coming to Utah. Well, this is huge. I mean, when this company first started 29 years ago, they only had 18 employees. They now have 6,500 employees. This could be, over the next decade, one of the largest employers in the state. So it's a huge boon for us, and it came through one of the connections I had. But it wasn't funded by UTA. UTA didn't have anyone on the trip. There were 2 board members from UTA there, but they weren't there as board members of UTA. These were guys that have political action committees that raised funds to educate lawmakers. Well, that's a natural place for us to go to raise funds from to do this trip. And they said, well, can we come? And we said, we can't. You can, as long as you pay your own way. So they did. These guys paid their own way to be there. And that's all the controversy there really is behind it. But I think it's going to be a huge benefit to the state. And I'm really excited to see them come, and I'm really excited to see how this could evolve and maybe get UTA to be a better run agency. So there's some things I think that are going to be very beneficial.
What is the role of a state senator and or representative?
Oh, well, there are specific roles and responsibilities, and then there are the general roles and responsibilities. As a senator, you have some of the constitutional responsibilities, such as advise and consent for any political appointees from the governor's office, including judges, the Utah State Supreme Court and whatnot. They come before the state Senate to be vetted and then voted on as to whether or not they will receive that political appointment or not. So there are those specific roles. It's a 4-year term, and the Senate's more of a deliberative body than the House is. There are only 29 members of the Senate versus 75 members of the House. So your vote actually counts. It's a little bit higher weighted of importance in the vote on any bill, on any piece of legislation. But generally, I would say the roles between the two are very similar. As I said before, it's about communication and building relationships of trust, public trust, and making sure that people understand the issues, educating them on what the issues are, and then helping them understand the back stories of information they may not get through the media that help form how we vote on things. So in general, those are what we look at doing, and that's exactly how I operate. These are the principles I live by, and these are what I believe are the proper roles of government, and then I vote accordingly. And if anything varies from that, I usually then explain to people why that's varied, and help people understand more of the backstory that they may not get through normal media channels. So, in a nutshell, that's it. Being people of highest integrity and honesty, and being a public servant versus a politician, I think, is what we call statesmanship. So, and that's what exactly I'm trying to do and will be for people.
What role does the U.S. Constitution play in the state legislature?
It's a great question. So, the Utah State Constitution is basically mimics or almost duplicates the U.S. Constitution. Not in all things. It's the Utah Constitution is more broad and expansive than the federal Constitution. But there is this inherent separation of powers component to the federal Constitution, and what is known as the Supremacy Clause. So in essence, if the Constitution is silent on the U.S. Constitution, and Congress hasn't subsequently acted through statute to create precedent on the federal level. The 10th Amendment of the Bill of Rights says that those powers are then delegated, or not delegated, but reserved for the people. Those powers are reserved for the people and the states. So if the federal Constitution, the federal government doesn't act or create law, the states control in those areas. And it's, federalism at its highest level. I believe that to a large extent the federal government has slowly scope creeped. It's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And Congress, quite literally, when they pass a law, they've granted rulemaking authority to the executive branch. And their rulemaking authority gives them the rights to expand their influence and power and authority without congressional oversight. You've seen it with the EPA, you've seen it with the U.S. Department of Education, you've seen it with the Department of Interior and the BLM and their land management processes. I mean, every agency in federal government has grown beyond its original intent and scope. And unless Congress is willing to rein them in, they're going to continue to function, they're going to continue to expand. In fact, Congress last year only passed about 800 pages of new statute. The Federal Registry, which shows all the rules that were done by these agencies, was 87,000 pages in new rules. To give you an idea, that's like 8 foot tall, 2 stacks 8 foot tall versus an 1.5 inches thick. That's an enormous amount of regulation. It's an enormous amount of pushing upon the people the will of the few in Washington, D.C. I am a federalist, and I believe that the states are the fourth branch of government and should have and do have the authority to push back against the federal government. And in doing so, I think the fight in the last days, the fight here before us in the next 10 to 20 years is going to be here at the state level. It's going to be men and women standing up saying, enough's enough, we're not going to do that. And it's going to be hard because they're going to say, well, the supremacy clause, and we're telling you what you have to do. And it's a fine line. I think we see our governor do it. We see the state legislature do it. We're constantly pushing back on those federal overreaches. It's a big issue, and it's something that I think that we have to be informed, we have to be educated, and we have to be vigilant, or the federal government will continue to have this scope creep to a point where they're going to, the executive branch is going to be basically a de facto king, and the Congress is going to be so impotent that they're not going to be able to do anything whatsoever. And at that time, it's going to be the states that are going to have to stand up and say, enough's enough, we're not doing this. It's not going to be pleasant, but I think that in every single one of my bills, there's an element of federalism. We can act on our own accord and govern ourselves accordingly. We have correct principles, and we should govern ourselves. We don't need to be told what to do and how to do it from the federal government in all instances. That being said, there is absolutely a role for the federal government, but I think it should be limited in scope in every instance possible. But that's not what Congress has done for the last 80 years. They've abdicated their authority to the executive branch by granting rulemaking authority in every piece of legislation they write. I think that's a bad way to run a government.
Is there anything else you would like us to know about you?
I'm dedicated. I'm willing to serve. I love Lehigh, Saratoga Springs, and Eagle Mountain, Harriman, and Highland. I love northern Utah County, southern Salt Lake County. I mean, we're the youngest demographic. We've got more children per capita than any other district in the nation. And we care about families, and we care about our rights, and we care about proper roles of government. We care about the principles upon which we should be governing, that government derives its power from the people, granted from the people, and not the other way around. People don't get their rights from the government. Those rights are given from God. And I will stand up and protect our family values. I will stand up and protect our state and our constituents, while also working and striving to meet the needs of our vastly growing area. I mean, we're growing faster than any other area in most of the rest of the nation. And if we do it responsibly and we do it in a very systematic, managed approach, we'll be successful. And I have a ton of hope. I'm really excited about the future and what we can do and what we can accomplish. And quite literally, I want everybody to know they can contact me at any time. if they have questions, if they want to talk, if they want to share their concerns, give me a call and let's talk and let's be engaged. I mean, it's all about building those relationships of trust and helping me understand what the issues are and where you're coming from, and let's work together. And I really look forward to the opportunity of serving the people in this district.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. We appreciate your candor and honesty to these questions. We look forward to following you throughout this next session and your run for Senate.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And thank you for coming today.